All right, welcome back to the RotoViz user guide. We're looking at an in-season tool here this week, which is the NFL Weekly Stat Explorer. If you head over to the website and you find tools in the menu, there's a drop down. You can click on NFL Weekly Stat Explorer. Now, what I like to do with this tool is use it to look at a range of weeks and then compare a number of players at once, sometimes looking at players across a position, across the league, or sometimes those for a specific team. So when you open it up, there's going to be a number of fields that you can use to change what displays in the table. You can use this position drop down to go position by position. You can also look at wide receivers, tight ends, and running backs all at once by selecting flex. Then in the categories, it's pretty simple here. You have passing stats, receiving stats, rushing stats. You can also look at opportunity, which we will do fantasy scoring, and expected points. I will talk about expected points here because expected points are one of the things that we use very, very extensively at RotoViz. Essentially, what's happening with expected points, it might be a little bit different for us than what you hear about expected points when you're maybe looking at a website that is showing you from an NFL perspective statistics. For us, expected points are calculated by having the computer go out and for every situation that a player finds themselves in, it determines the expected number of fantasy points. So if a player gets a rushing attempt on 1st and 10 at the 43-yard line when his team is down 7 points, what on average is the number of fantasy points that a player scores. So essentially what it's doing is it's looking at the very unique context of an opportunity that a player has, looking backward at all the times those plays have happened before to say, in this situation, when this player gets this type of opportunity, or not when a player gets this type of opportunity based on that entire game context we just talked about, this is the number of points it normally equates to. So you can use that to look at the opportunity that a player had and determine how many fantasy points they roughly should have had. So to make that a little bit more clear, let's look just at week 2. And I can do that by coming into the week start field. Like I said, you can look at a range of weeks here. I mean, I can look from 2020 to 2024 if I want. Or I can look at, a single week in a season or a whole season just by toggling the year start, week start, year end, and weekend filters in the tool. But let's look at just week 2 of 2024. And we can see, for example, that Amon-Ra St. Brown had 30.5 expected points, of which 30.5 came from receiving. So when you look in our tools, if you see EP, that means expected points. FPOE is going to be fantasy points over expectation. So if it is a positive number, that means that the player recorded more fantasy points than you would expect, given that math that I talked about prior that comes up to expected points. Likewise, in this case, we have St. Brown going for negative 7.6. That means that he was not as efficient with his opportunities as we would expect. Or said differently, his actual fantasy point scoring did not match that baseline expectation from expected points. So essentially what this is telling us is, given the opportunity that St. Brown had, and we'll go take a quick look at that, when you account for the context of each of those opportunities, you'd expect a player to score around 30.5 fantasy points. Now, he had 19 targets, so it's easy to understand why he had so many expected points. And then when you look at, like I said, at the down, distance, specifics of each of those targets, it comes up to that 30.5 expected points. And this is really useful because if we do something where we go to expected points and then maybe we go into our teams drop down and we'll remove all, and then I'll just select Detroit, we can take a look. And we can say in week 2, Amon-Ra St. Brown had 30.5 expected points. Jamison Williams had 20.6. Jahmyr Gibbs had 19.3. David Montgomery had 13.7. What you'll find sometimes is if you don't look into the expected points, you could overweight just the total fantasy points that a player scored, right? Because, for example, if we now toggle to fantasy scoring, we'll see that Amon-Ra St. Brown had 22.9 PPR. Jamison Williams had 14.4. Now, in this case, the delta between that scoring is fairly in line with what we saw when we looked at the expected points versus the actual points. But you might have cases where maybe Williams had a touchdown and St. Brown had a few less targets and things were kind of different. We'll try to find an example of that here quickly, but it lets you better gauge a player's opportunity than what you might realize by singularly looking at PPR scoring or even just targets, as some targets are more valuable than others. For example, if you're getting targeted in cases where your team is 10 or fewer yards from the end zone, you're more likely to get a touchdown. As a result, those targets carry more expected fantasy points with them. Let me find another example. I'm trying to think of one off of my head here. Don't know if I have a great one this week. Let's take a look here at the Giants. So we can see that Neighbors finishes with 28.7, Wan'Dale Robinson at 9.8, Darius Slayton at 8.3. If we go over to expected points, we might see something different here, right? Because those numbers made us think that Slayton and Robinson would have had a similar game. Well, and in this case, it does bear out that way with 7.6 expected points for Slayton, 7 EP for Wan'Dale Robinson. Let's expand this, though, and look at weeks 1 through week 2. We can see that Wan'Dale Robinson has 26.9 expected points. Darius Slayton is at 11.9. And again, we can pop over fantasy scoring now, and we can see what they've actually managed. So you have Robinson at 21.6, Slayton at 13.9. Now, in the couple examples I looked at here, we didn't see any drastic changes, but sometimes you will. So that's one thing I like to look at in this tool. Another thing you could look at would be opportunity. And what you're going to see in here is you can get a player's snap count for this selected time range, their snap percentage, which is going to say of the percentage of plays that they were able to participate in based on the games that they were in, what percentage were they in. We have target share. So in this case, we can see Malik Neighbors in 2024 currently has had 38% of the Giants' targets come his way. Robinson at 25 is the second player on the team. And you'll notice that you can click on a specific stat and you'll change the way that the table is sorted. So in this case, if I wanted to go targets, high to low, I could click it once, click it again. And now we're going to have Neighbors here with 25, Robinson with 16. Rushing attempts in here, and when you put this all together, you can get total opportunity, which is attempts plus targets. Devin Singletary leading the team currently with 30% of opportunities. Likewise, I don't know why I'm saying likewise here, but another thing you can do is you can go to all. We could look at receiving stats. You could remove the team, just go back to select all. And now we could look at player stats from across our selected range. Well, maybe we just want to go back and look at the back half of 2023. And I'll change my year start to 2023. I'll change my year end to 2023. And then my week start, maybe we'll go from week 10 on. And we can look at totals, but maybe we're not so concerned about totals as much as we are about per game numbers. So we could go from total here to per game. And once we do that, we could see that the leader in, let's go yards. Click it one more time. And now we have it sorted high to low. The leader in yards per game from week 10 to 18 of 2023 was Keenan Allen with 104, followed by Tyreek Hill, CeeDee Lamb, Justin Jefferson, all four of those guys going for more than 100 yards. if we keep scrolling down to the bottom, we can scroll over and we can also take a look at a couple more stats. Like, we'll actually talk about these in a second in a slightly different context. And the other neat thing that you can do is if you want, you can click this download to CSV button and you can pop these into a spreadsheet. So maybe we want to go back to 2024 and we're curious about the receiving numbers for the Giants. We'll continue with that example, kind of interesting here. And I'm going to toggle off of per game. We'll leave per game on at this point. Maybe we just want to look at wide receiver. So we go to wide receiver. Again, I've got to go to select teams. I've got to select the New York Giants. All right. So targets, Neighbors is at 12.5 per game, followed by Robinson at 8. We can see yards per game. Neighbors is at 96.5. Next closest is Robinson at 31. But what I really like to do is look at the target share. As we talked about, Neighbors is at 38. Robinson's at 25%. I also like to look at air yards per target. Air yards, if you are unaware, it's the amount of distance that the ball travels to go to the wide receiver. So if a wide receiver is 25 yards downfield when he goes to make a catch, that's 25 air yards, regardless of if he converts into a catch or not. That can be looked at on a target basis for air yards per target. Yak is yards after the catch. Racer tells us how well a player does at converting the air yards thrown at them into actual yards. This will show you the team percentage here. So Neighbors has 51% of the Giants' air yards. We continue scrolling across. There's some more things we can look at. You can look at weighted opportunity rating, which is going to look at a couple of the metrics related to air yards, blend them together in the way that's most predictive of future output. So Whopper is very useful to look at it. I kind of think of it as like the quality of a player's opportunity from an air yards perspective, with higher numbers signaling that we can expect things to carry, more or less. You can do some reading on the site that will break that down a little bit more. And then air yak is what you get when you combine air yards and yards after the catch. So I think this is a useful way to look at players on a team. You know, we could switch it. Maybe we would look at running back and then we would go to rushing, and we could compare things that way. And again, you can play around with the range of time. You can play around with if it's total or per game, pull in different teams, and then you can download to CSV. So this is a useful way to either look at a team in isolation for either a single week or a range of weeks, or look at a specific position. Actually, let's go to running back right now. So if we go to running back in our position filter, categories rushing, what player has the highest percentage of his team's attempts? Currently, that's Bijan Robinson at 82, followed by Jordan Mason with 76. You can get the yards, touchdowns, yards per carry, fumbles, some quick numbers there. So hopefully that gives you a little bit more information on where you can go if you want to do that type of analysis and look at player stats across a range of games. And again, I like to use it also to quickly drill into a specific team. So that is it for our walkthrough of the NFL Weekly Stat Explorer. We will be back soon with another user guide walkthrough.